Tonight, somewhere in your city, a radio tower is transmitting. Music, news, a voice, and you barely notice it. But on the night of April 30th, 1945, a single radio broadcast changed the meaning of that signal forever. Because what went out over the airwaves that night was not news. It was the sound of an empire dying. You have to understand what radio meant in 1945. This was not background noise. This was the voice of power itself. Adolf Hitler had built the Third Reich on that voice. His regime distributed over 16 million cheap radio sets across Germany, the Volksempfänger, the People's Receiver, so that every home, every pub, every factory floor could hear the voice of National Socialism at any hour. Radio historian Kate Lacey, in her foundational study on German broadcasting, described the Nazi use of radio as the most sophisticated weaponization of a single medium in the history of modern propaganda. It was not enough to print the message. It had to be heard. It had to feel present. It had to feel alive. And now it was about to go silent. The date was April 30th, 1945. In a concrete bunker 55 feet below the Reich Chancellery Garden in Berlin, Adolf Hitler had been dead for less than 6 hours. The Soviet Red Army was fighting street by street, building by building, less than 400 meters from that garden. The city above was in ruins. Smoke columns rose across the skyline. Artillery shells fell with such regularity that civilians had stopped flinching at the sound. The war in Europe had 9 days left, but no one on the ground knew that yet. What they knew was the radio. Reichsrundfunkgesellschaft, the Reich Broadcasting Corporation, had been the official state broadcaster since 1933. Through 12 years and 6 million dead, it had never stopped broadcasting. It had announced the invasion of Poland. It had declared the fall of Paris. It had read the Führer's speeches word for word in real time, while German families sat in their kitchens and listened and believed. Now, in the final hours, the station faced a moment it had never prepared for. It had to announce the end of the man who had invented it as a political instrument. Historian Ian Kershaw, whose exhaustive 2-volume biography of Hitler remains the definitive account of the Nazi era, documented what those final bunker hours looked like in granular detail. By midday on April 30th, Hitler had already said his private farewells. He had shaken hands with officers. He had embraced secretaries. He had kissed Eva Braun, who had become his wife less than 40 hours earlier in a brief civil ceremony in the bunker conference room. Then the doors to his private study closed. 2 gunshots were not heard over the artillery. His adjutants waited 10 minutes before entering. What propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels chose to do with that information is one of the strangest decisions in modern media history. He waited, not for a few minutes, not for an hour. He waited until the following day, May 1st, 1945, before allowing the German radio network to announce the death of Adolf Hitler. And when the announcement came, it was wrapped in one of the most carefully constructed pieces of audio theatre ever produced. The broadcast did not begin with news. It began with music. Specifically, it began with the second movement of Anton Bruckner's 7th Symphony, a funeral adagio that Bruckner himself had composed anticipating the death of Richard Wagner. It was mournful, enormous, slow. It played for several minutes in full before a single word was spoken. Media scholar Victor Klemperer, who survived the Nazi era and documented the language and tactics of Third Reich communications in his diary later published as The Language of the Third Reich, wrote that the regime had always understood that emotion preceded information. You felt the message before you understood it, that Bruckner movement was not chosen casually. It was chosen because it was grief made audible. It was designed to make the listener feel the weight of the moment before being told what the moment was. Then came Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. Hitler, in his final political testament written the previous night, had appointed Dönitz as his successor. Not Goebbels, not Himmler, not Göring, who had been stripped of his ranks for a desperate telegram sent days earlier. Dönitz, a naval officer who had spent the war commanding U-boats from the North Sea, was now, officially and absurdly, the head of the German Reich. His voice came over the radio at 10:26 p.m. on May 1st. He did not say Hitler was dead. Not at first. He said Hitler had fallen fighting at the head of his troops. That he had died a hero's death. This was a lie that almost no one believed, but that almost no one had the means to contradict. The Red Army was in Berlin. The Western Allies were at the Elbe. The German civilian population had no independent source of information. All they had was the radio, and the radio said the Führer had died in battle. Historian Richard Evans, in his landmark 3-volume History of the Third Reich, noted that this final deception was perhaps the most telling of all. Even in the moment of total defeat, even with Soviet soldiers within blocks of the bunker, the regime's first instinct was to construct a narrative rather than report a reality. 12 years of absolute control over information had produced a propaganda apparatus so deeply embedded that it continued operating on instinct, even as its operators fled or died. The broadcast lasted less than 4 minutes, and then the music returned. For a long time after Dönitz finished speaking, German families sat in front of their Volksempfänger sets and listened to music they did not recognize, playing over a frequency that had told them for 12 years that Germany was winning. The cognitive gap between what they were hearing and what they knew to be true outside their windows, the fires, the rubble, the Soviet soldiers moving through the streets, must have been absolute. Sociologist Robert Gelately, who studied German civilian psychological responses to defeat in his work Backing Hitler, documented accounts of people weeping not at the announcement of Hitler's death, but at the sound of the music itself. The music meant it was over. The music was the truth that the words refused to say. By May 2nd, Berlin had fallen completely. The Reich Broadcasting Corporation transmitted its final broadcast at 11:47 p.m. on May 8, 1945, the moment of unconditional surrender. For 12 minutes, German state radio played fragments of Beethoven, Schubert, and a military march whose name no one later remembered. Then the transmitter in Flensburg, one of the last still operating, went silent. Not dramatically. Not with a closing speech or a final declaration. It simply stopped. The carrier signal cut, the frequency went dead, and somewhere across a ruined Germany, 16 million cheap radio sets received nothing. That silence was the truest thing the Reich Broadcasting Corporation had ever transmitted. 12 years of language, of carefully assembled words designed to reshape reality, and the final truth they told was the absence of sound. Sociologist Norbert Elias wrote in his study of German national identity that defeat does not announce itself. It is experienced as an interruption. Something that was present is suddenly not present. The music stops, the voice stops, and in that stopping, something that had felt permanent reveals itself to have been only temporary. You live in a world of permanent signal. Your phone fills silence before you notice it. Your speakers answer your questions before you finish asking them. Algorithms know what you want to hear before you know you want to hear it. You will never experience a moment when the transmitter goes dead, and the silence means it is over. But on the night of May 8th, 1945, 16 million families across Germany sat in front of their radios and felt what happens when the voice of an entire world simply stops. And in that silence, the real education began. Not from a broadcast, not from a speech, from nothing at all. Tonight, somewhere in your city, a radio tower is transmitting, and the fact that it is still transmitting means something that, in 1945, felt like It could never be taken for granted again.